Thank you. And it's such a pleasure to be here. So many of you, I'm excited that you have come and you've made this journey. It says so much that people who are often volunteering, and most of you, most of us on boards are in fact volunteering, also find time to figure out how to strengthen your skills, how to learn more from others who are in the same position, and how to become better stewards for the nation's organizations trying to make us a better land. Ultimately, what you're about is leadership. And I want to talk about leadership for a moment. Many of you were asked to be on boards and you've risen to the positions of influence that you have within your organizations and in your communities because you were already exhibiting leadership. You were stepping beyond whatever it was you had to do to think about others and look at other ways that you could make a contribution. It's because of that leadership that you were tapped. But you were tapped to do something special, to help an organization, either on staff or in a board position, to help that organization make its best contribution. Part of what you've had to do is really study the assets of the organization and think about what it can bring to its mission. Look at where the gaps are and what's missing. But also, you really are forced to think about the future. Because when you're a part of an organization trying to do better, it's important that you align what it is that you aspire to do with what the future challenges are going to be, what the future focus will be, what the future conversations are going to be about, so that your organization remains healthy and remains relevant. That's very important. I'm also sure that because of your connection with the organization, you see the world in a slightly different way. I'm always personally amused at myself when I read something in the New York Times science section that I had absolutely no knowledge about before, and all of a sudden I start seeing it all around me. When I meet an artist and the artist tells me about their whole area of work and I start noticing that and noticing aspects of art that I hadn't noticed before, the same is true with organizations. You get into an organization, you find out about homelessness, about the education challenges, about climate change. You find out more about an area that was on your periphery before, and that changes the way you look at the world. It also gives you an opportunity to educate your family and your friends, and then you find that because you now are seeing things differently, you become part of an iterative process with the organization, bringing things back into it, helping it to be sharper. And so what I want to help you think about and hope you will help me think about in the question and answer period is what's this future that we're about to enter that all of our organizations absolutely have to relate to? What are the challenges that we are going to be thinking about for the next 25 years or more as we move deeper into the 21st century? Certainly, one of them is climate change, that we can't avoid having to think about that. We're thinking about it more in our day-to-day lives. We're making our own decisions a little differently. But as a nation and in every community, we have to think about how it is that we are going to deal with this challenge. It holds for us some new avenues, some that we have avoided for a long time, like public transportation. I don't know how many of you had the experience that I had. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, where the streetcars were very common. I was in Detroit just a couple of days ago, and there I was talking to a lot of people about the fact that down there, major thoroughfare, there used to be streetcars running all the time. All those streetcars have disappeared. They disappeared, the highways came, the suburbs came. If we're going to deal with climate change, we have to begin to think about getting back into public transportation. We also are going to have to think about using our already built environments. We've become a nation of throwaway places. Throw away our cities, move to the suburbs, throw away that suburb, go to another suburban area, just throwing away places. In order to deal with the climate change challenge, we're going to have to move back, live in more dense communities, use those places we've been throwing away. We're going to have to make sure that those places that we're moving back to are places that we want to live. Places that aren't contributing to climate change. You know, buildings and houses contribute a lot to climate change. We need to make sure that we're retrofitting those places, that we're making them part of a future we want to be a part of. But people will not move back to cities if the schools there don't work. They won't move back to cities if there are no grocery stores, no drug stores. They won't move back if the streets aren't safe. They won't move back if they're not attractive places. So as we think about the climate change challenge of the future, it forces us to rethink a lot about our living patterns, how we get around, and how we've made investments. Another thing we're going to be thinking about as we go forward is the middle class. We haven't thought a lot about the middle class because we've just had such a vast middle class. And so many Americans have grown up in the middle class, and their parents were middle class, and they expected their children would be also. The thing that has made this country distinct and strong and a place that people have looked to globally has been our vast and stable middle class. You pick any poor country, and what makes that country poor is not the absence of rich people. All the poor countries have rich people, and all the rich countries have poor people. What makes the country exceptional is its vast and stable middle class, and it's under assault. It's vulnerable. It's shrinking. People in it are hanging on by their fingernails. If this country is going to continue to be strong, it has to figure out a way to have a vast and stable middle class into the future. The other thing that we're going to be thinking about, I don't know if it's going to be 25 years, because I don't know if we have 25 years, is how to have a strong and stable economy. We got to get that right pretty quick, or everything else is going to fall. But when we think about that, it has to be an economy that can be competitive in the global context. We have to figure out an economy that can employ the people who are in this nation. It has to be an economy that is producing things that we feel good about. And so as we think about those three things, there's one more thing that we're going to be thinking about a lot as we go forward, and that has to do with our changing demographics. This year, by the end of this year, and we only have another month left in this year after this one, the majority of babies born in this nation will be babies of color. Already, 40% of children under 18 are of color. By 2023, the majority of those under 18 will be children of color. And by the year 2042, or by the year 2050 at the latest, the majority of people in this nation will be people of color. And for too many people of color, the outlook is not very bright. That when we think about disparities in education, disparities in health, disparities in terms of job preparedness, it doesn't look good if that is our future. I say to American people, America can see its future, and it's a 5-year-old Latina girl. We know where she lives, we know what she needs, and we know what her prospects are, depending on what it is that we do now. It's a 7-year-old black boy. We know where he is, we know what he needs, we know what investments we want to make. And so as we think about our future, it very much depends on how we solve those three big problems I talked about in the context of the changing demographics. When I talked about these issues of climate change and how we need to get out of our cars and get into public transportation, we're not going to be comfortable in public transportation unless we're comfortable sitting next to the other. And we have to overcome a lot before that's generally a comfort level for the American people. That we're not going to move back to the older inner ring suburbs that we moved away from, or to the cities that we moved away from, unless we haven't made those investments in communities that we have resisted making investments in up until now. We've been disinvesting in those places. The grocery stores have been moving out. The parks have been shutting down. The streets have been absolutely neglected. We have not made that our highest priority. And if we're going to make it a priority, we have to invest in the places where people live now who are being left behind. We have to make sure that the houses that they live in are the houses that we would be happy to live in. We have to get back to living in economically integrated communities. Those of you who have heard me speak before have heard me talk about growing up in a segregated St. Louis in the 1950s and the 1960s. And the neighborhood that I lived in was all black, except for one white family that lived across the street. But when we moved in, it was all white. And I've often said that I know that I came from a powerful family because we were able to cause all those white people to move out. Even though the community I lived in was all black, and it was true for the places where we learned and played and prayed and volunteered. It was the most integrated place I've ever lived. It was integrated because of segregation. All the black people lived in my community within an area that one could get around on a bus or walking very quickly. All the doctors lived there, all the lawyers lived there, all the business people lived there, all the families that were receiving aid to families with dependent children, all the janitors lived there. The man next door to me was a small contractor. Everybody lived in that community. Even though it was all black, it was economically integrated. And it was strong and vibrant because of that. We've got to figure out how to get back to that. It's going to change a lot. When we think about this, yes, thank you for that. When we think about the middle class, we have to invest in the people who have skin in that game. And that's the people who are now striving to be in the middle class. So our educational investment will mean everything. We know we need to improve our schools, but we have to improve our schools if we want people as they grow up to be able to get good jobs, to be contributing, to be able to buy homes, to be good neighbors, to be democratic participants in this society. We have to invest in the people who are going to be the middle class if we want to be a nation that has a vast middle class. And as we think about how we're going to compete in the 21st century, we have to have a workforce that can compete in the 21st century. And that requires that we invest in the people who are going to be that workforce. Now, we have been working for a long time, and I'm sure that most of your organizations, if not all of them, are working on some aspect of the problem that I've just described in some way. I didn't talk a lot about health, but I could have. Because we have become a nation in which where you live is a proxy for opportunity, literally. Where you live is a proxy for opportunity. Your address, your zip code has more to say about what your prospects than anything else. Because where you live determines whether or not you get to go to a good school. It determines whether or not you live near employment or you live in a community that is itself a natural job network. And that's how people get jobs, through natural job networks. I'll bet you if you think about where you got your first job, it may even be where you got your last job. It's because somebody you knew worked there, knew about it, had a hookup for you. Meet this person. That's how it happens. If you live around a natural job network, your job prospects are better. If you're lucky enough to live near public transportation, then connect you to a job. That's how you get a job. Where you live even determines how long you live and how well you live. There was a study done right here in the Bay Area where you're visiting that found that people who live in the Berkeley Hills, and if you go across the Bay Bridge, that is one of our more affluent areas, people who live in the Berkeley Hills live on average 10 to 15 years longer than people who live in the Oakland Flatlands, a distance of probably 3 to 5 miles, not that much, but 15-year difference in terms of how long people live. We have an obesity crisis in this country. 35% of African American children are overweight or obese, about 40% of Latino children. If you read the New York Times or one of the papers yesterday talking about the growing gap between black academic performance and white, you see that that gap continues to be huge and in some instances growing. We have huge problems that I'm sure you're working on in one way or another. Obesity, asthma, access to health care, early childhood education, teenage pregnancy, youth development, the problems of incarceration, how to help people when they're coming out of prison, how to think about the new economy and the green economy, how to deal with the environmental issues, how to help young people to have a sense of civic engagement. All of the issues that you're working on or thinking about, we need to bring an equity lens to them. Because if we don't bring an equity lens, we're not working on them in a way that is thinking about the future. Too many people are trying to bury their heads in the sand and act as if these are not issues that we have to address now. Some people like to say, well, it's an important issue. We'll work on this, 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 and then we'll work on equity. But what about the equity in this, this, and that? Because if you're doing it just over here, you're missing the opportunity to truly advance equity. So many people in this nation right now seem to feel that we can somehow avoid what's coming. They're nostalgic for a time that never was, while trying to avoid a future that is inevitable. And where will that get us? We only have one way to go forward. We only have one way to go forward. and that is the equity path. I've been working on this all my life. Well, not all my life. Actually, I can't redo history. I mean, you know, I was a child, and I was a happy child, and I wasn't working on these issues, though my mom and dad were. I was told the story just the other day, which I'll share with you, just because I lost my dad last summer. And he was such an inspiration to me. When I was a little girl, we lived in St. Louis, and when we traveled south like everybody else who was black, because that's where our roots were. We went south in the summer in the car, and they were wonderful trips. When we first started taking those trips, the nation was segregated, and we used to stop in black teachers' colleges that would open up in the summer, so black families traveling would have lovely places to stay. And I recall them with great fondness, being there with some of the students during the summer. Well, in the mid-'60s, when the civil rights legislation started to go, and one of the civil rights legislations had to do with public accommodations, we started stopping in hotels. And one of the places we would often stop was the Howard Johnson. And when we weren't stopping there to spend the night, we would just stop and eat along the way. And we very much enjoyed stopping at the Howard Johnson. This particular summer, we'd stopped at several Howard Johnsons along the way. And we came to one after we traveled deeper into the South. And when we were walking up to the Howard Johnson, where my brother and I were looking forward to getting the hot dogs because they were really good, the owner, or the maitre d', or the manager, came out. It was my dad, my mom, my grandmother. I was there with my two brothers, and stopped us and said, "Do you have a reservation?" And my father said, "We had been stopping at Howard Johnson's all along the way. You don't have to have a reservation to stop and have a meal in Howard Johnson's." And the manager said, "Well, you have to have one here. Do you have a reservation?" And my father said, "No." And he sent the family back to the car, and we could still see him. My mother and my grandmother were really anxious. I heard them worrying about whether or not my father was going to get arrested, because what he did, for what I often say was 2 hours, but you know, it just might have seemed like 2 hours, maybe it was just 20 minutes. For 2 hours or so, he asked every white person coming up to the Howard Johnsons if they had a reservation. And none of them did. And he walked them up to the manager, announced that they did not have a reservation, and the manager turned them away. And people were walking away shaking their heads. He did that until he was quite satisfied. He'd gotten rid of his anger. He came back to the car. We had a big laugh about it and went on and had a joyful vacation. So I wasn't working on these issues, but I was exposed to them all my life. But from the time that I became a professional, from the time I graduated from college, because I was an organizer right out of college, I've been working on equity. Sometimes I called it social justice, sometimes I called it racial justice, sometimes I called it different things, but I know now that I was always working on equity. But I felt that I was working on it because it was the right thing to do, because it was the moral thing to do. I felt I was working on it because people were being left behind, and it broke my heart. And I knew that people had extraordinary potential because I had grown up with people with extraordinary potential, but they hadn't been as lucky as I was, and I saw that they didn't fulfill it. I've worked on it because it just seemed that we ought to do it. And many of you have probably worked on it for exactly that same reason. And I just want to lift us all into a higher place. Because while it's good to work on it because it's moral, and it's good to work on it because it's right, and we should always work on it for those reasons, we're at a point in which the nation will not thrive if it doesn't become equitable. Equity is not a cry from special interest groups. For the nation, given the challenges that we know about, equity is the superior growth model. It is a superior growth model for the nation. Because only by investing equitably, and that doesn't just mean Black and Latino and Asian and Native American. Equity means providing what those need to reach their full potential. Equity means just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate and prosper. In short, equity creates a path from hope to change, so that poor white people living in rural America, they need equity. That people living on Indian reservations, they need equity. Young people who are feeling lost and left out need equity. Latino people who are in this country and bringing such vibrancy to our communities need equity. And African Americans need equity. America needs equity, because if we invest in everyone to allow them to reach their full potential, we will capture everyone. We will have strategies that are inclusive, and we will solve the problem of the vanishing middle class. We will solve the problem of not being a productive nation. We will solve the problems of climate change, and we will solve the problems of how to have a democracy that we can absolutely feel good about. So thank you. And so, to return where I started, leadership. I'm happy that you are here. I'm happy that you are here learning how to be a good steward, learning how to look at the financial statements and ask the right questions. I'm happy that you are here learning how to be able to be a good board member, how to be a good leader, and to lead in the future that we are entering. We have to all be boundary crossers. We have to be boundary crossers. Stuart Quo, who helped to write the book with me, Uncommon Common Ground, talks about boundary crossing leadership, how it is that we have to listen differently. We have to ask different questions. We have to understand what's going on in the world. We have to see who else has to join with us to solve these problems if we're going to do so sustainably. We all have to be boundary crossing leaders. My friend Manuel Pastor, the other person who wrote the book, always says that if we ever want to put race behind us, we have to put it up front first. You have to put race up front in order to put it behind you. You have to acknowledge the racial problems that we have, the racial work that is undone, the racial prejudice that we still carry around, the legacy of racism that is still with us, even if we have moved beyond racism in our hearts. It's still in our institutions. We have to be the leaders to put race up front if we're going to put it behind us. We have to be leaders that are comfortable talking with our neighbors and our friends and our colleagues. I think for all of us, some of our most uncomfortable moments are going to come up in a couple of weeks around that Thanksgiving table. When around that Thanksgiving table, you have someone who says something that is so backwards, that is so mean, that is so uninformed, and you know you're having a good time. And you don't want to mess it up. You don't want to be the skunk at the garden party. But we have to learn how to be uncomfortable and be comfortable with it. Because if you believe the things that we're talking about here, you know that many of your colleagues haven't thought about them. If they thought about them, they'd have to do a lot of work to get there. You have to help them get there. We all have to be equity leaders. We have to do it because it's right. We have to do it because it's moral. And we have to do it because it's an imperative. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. That was very warm.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful, inspiring, and heartfelt. And we want to provide an opportunity to hear from you, questions to Angela. And we welcome them from the audience. We will have 3 runners with microphones. So if you just wave your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. And I see a mic back there. But I have a question for you first as we're waiting for others to form their questions. The first that I would ask, and we had a privilege of talking over lunch a bit about it, how do we create opportunity for equity in boardrooms?
That's a good question. We have to be intentional about it. We have to decide that we need it. I think that very often we set out to change our boards just because we think they ought to be more diverse. And one of the things that we talk about in the book is diversity and justice. And we make the point that diversity and justice, social justice, they're not the same thing. They're not the same thing. It is important to be diverse, that we live in a diverse society and everything we do should reflect that diversity. So it is important. But just because you are diverse does not mean that you have achieved your justice goals. Because if what you really want to do is to make sure that you're talking about what the problems are, that you're thinking about how to find solutions that are more inclusive, that you're thinking about how to make sure that the work that you're doing is getting to the right people in ways that are respectful of who they are and all their cultures, that requires something different. And so I think one of the answers to how to bring equity into the board is to really have a conversation about some of the things that I was talking about. What are the demographics in the places that we are? And how do we make sure that our boards reflect those demographics, not just because they ought to, but because you'll get a better sense of how to connect to the people and communities that you want to serve. But then to ask, what do we want to accomplish? Are we reaching people? Are we reaching people in ways that are respectful? Do we have a feedback loop? Are we connecting to other organizations that are part of the solutions that we want? And that'll take you into looking for people who bring different qualities and different experiences. So if you start with what is our goal and what are we missing in order to fully get it, and back from there into how do we make sure our board reflects it, I think it will take you in those directions. The other thing I would encourage you to do is to really go about it in a way that is studious. Don't just go for the person that you happen to know, because that person may or may not bring it. I can't tell you how many times I've had the occasion of observing a board of some kind that was all white before, and now it has a black person on it. And when I talk to that black person, I find out, well, you know, they were the dentist of somebody who was on the board, or they were the college roommate of somebody. And while they may be perfectly wonderful people, they don't necessarily bring what it is that that board needs. It can, but it doesn't always. And so being studious about trying to find out who are the people who have the skills, where are they, how do we meet them, how do we reach out? I think those are some of the ways to do it.
Terrific, thank you. Other questions from the tables? We'd welcome them.
There's a hand.
Yes,
over
we
here.
have a hand right here in the second table. If you'd like to introduce yourselves, we'd love to know who you are.
Greetings, my name is Jewel Scott and I'm the Vice Chair of Bite Back in Washington, D.C. We are a technology school that teaches software and hardware skills to low-income adult learners. What we've done on our board, or our executive director has done, is institute a shock therapy to our board members in order for us to get a feel of who we serve. So we're a school of technology, so what she made all the board of directors do was to leave the board meeting and go down into the classrooms and actually interview our students, where they come from, how they hear about Bite Back, why they are there. Mm-hmm. Would you suggest that for board members that they do something like that? You know, get out there if they're with homeless shelters, get into a homeless shelter, spend the night there. Mm-hmm. I mean, what do you think about?
I think it's great. I think that's a wonderful thing to do, and I think there's really no substitute for finding out what your organization is really about. If you're on the board, being able to, if it's a soup kitchen, to hand out the soup, if it's teaching children to learn, to spend some time in the classroom, visiting a homeless shelter. I leave it to you whether or not you want to spend the night, but visiting a homeless shelter is a very good thing to do. I don't think there's any substitute for that, but there's also no substitute for talking about it. Because one of the experiences that I haven't had this experience recently, but for a period of time, whenever I would fly on an airplane and would talk to the person next to me, if that person was a business leader, almost inevitably, they had a mentoring experience. And I used to be very involved with mentoring. I had started something in Oakland called the Mentoring Center. And so I was interested in mentoring because I thought mentoring was a wonderful way to be able to get people to get to know someone that came from a different circumstance, to learn about their circumstance, and become committed not just to helping that person, but perhaps working on some of the policy obstacles that really are in the way and becoming leaders in the community. Oddly enough, too often, to my liking, the person who had been the mentor actually ended up having a negative experience about some of the policies I'd hoped they'd have a positive experience about. Because they'd been mentoring, usually it was a white man who had mentored a young black or Latino boy, and too often the story was, and things didn't get better. that he did drop out of school, or this negative thing happened, or that negative thing happened. And the whole story became a negative story. And I felt that one of the things that mentoring programs lacked, was to have a way for mentors to be able to debrief their experience and to have people to come in and talk to them about the educational system, about the criminal justice system, about the opportunities in community, so that people would have context more than the context of that boy, that family. Because if you only see that boy and that family and things don't work out well, and you've tried, because you've taken them to a ball game and you've tried to do some homework, then you begin to think, well, nothing works. It's hopeless. While I love the kid, I don't expect much for the kid. And so I think that for boards too, to go out and experience it without having a debriefing of it, with people to help you put what you've seen in context and understand how it relates to everything else, is not as strong an experience as it would be with that piece.
Terrific. Other questions? Yes, third table here, or third table?
I have the mic here.
Yes, he has the mic, so.
My name is Yazdiar Gauzi. I'm a consultant. I've worked in nonprofit all my life. Now I have the opportunity to share my experience, and I do some training and some executive coaching. That's for me. I'm from Fresno, California. You started your presentation very articulately by weaving the whole theme around climate change. My question to you is, the first Tuesday of this month, we've sent back a government in the legislature, majority, where a major number of its articulate, prominent leaders are prominent naysayers, climate project deniers. What type of strategy would you suggest from the nonprofit world to communicate with them and to sort of even re-educate or bring climate change back on the agenda, which is right now facing a rather major problem?
Yes, I too am worried. We do need to bring climate change and a bunch of other issues back onto the agenda, and we need to keep them on the agenda. We have to have an attitude about this. The attitude that I'm trying to have about it is that we are seeing something happen in this nation that I think reflects what I talked about in one of my phrases, nostalgic for a time that never was while avoiding a future that is inevitable. I think that's part of what we're seeing. And I think it's up to those of us who think that we know a way to be able to solve our problems, to be more inclusive, to be ready for the future in a way that is positive and productive, to keep it up, I don't know what to do beyond advocacy, organizing, bringing forward information, and talking to anybody who will listen to you about where we have to go and what we have to do. Now, a lot of people are already thinking, well, we better put that on the back burner, we better put that on the back burner. I'm not for putting anything on the back burner that we had on the front burner before, because it was on the front burner for a reason. And therefore, we have to keep everything that we think is good on the front burner and talk to people, because I will tell you, I am an optimistic person. I believe in people. I believe in the American people. I believe in the people who are representing us. And I always say that people start with my respect. You got my respect right off the bat. You have to earn my disrespect. And so we do a lot of work in Washington and on the Hill, and I plan to go to the Hill, and I plan to meet with the new people, and I plan to talk to people about what's right. They certainly may earn my disrespect, but I don't start off by assuming that with information and engagement and people seeing their self-interest, that some people won't come around and see it the right way. I think we have to try that before we give up on it. And so I would say, to the question that you have asked about climate change, but for those who care about quality public education, for those who care about transportation policy that puts public transportation, for those who care about green jobs and making sure that we're investing in them more, whatever your agenda is, you got there because you studied what the situation was, you know what the strategies are, you know where we have to go. Be vocal, be organized, be respectful until people have shown that they just don't want to learn and don't want to grow, and assume that we will get through this period that we were in. I don't think there's any question that we are moving toward a very different nation. You can tell from all of my talking that I think it's going to be positive. I think it's going to be wonderful. I think we have every opportunity for it to be inclusive. But I have no doubt that we're going to go through a grown zone before we get there. We're going to go through a grown zone. How low will it be? How long will it last? How painful? None of us know. But if we stay engaged, it'll be a shorter period, it will be less painful, and we will get to the other side. Stay in there. Thanks.
Terrific.
Good afternoon. My name is Pamela Barrett Nolan. I'm from the Center on Philanthropy in Bermuda. And it seems we were talking at our table at lunch that there's a theme running through the conference about getting boards out of the boardroom, not only to meet their clients, but to reach out to other community organizations to have impact on their community as a whole. You talked about bringing people back into the city. You talked about education. You talked about the environment. Your examples of successful collaboration in communities where they are having an impact, it's a big word, it's a hard thing. Talk to us about success.
Yeah, collaborations are really important, as are partnerships. And I believe in them absolutely, because I believe in trying to do the big and important things. I often say if your organization is embarked on something that you can do all by yourself, it probably isn't worth doing. Because to really do important things, you have to join with others. You have to learn how to be a good collaborator. You have to learn how to be a good partner. And I have seen some great ones throughout the country. I just left 21 of them because I arrived last night from Washington, D.C., where Policy Link, the organization I lead, was working with the 21 Promised Neighborhood grantees from around the country. You might not know about this, so let me just tell you. When President Obama was in, Senator Obama running for president, he said if he got to be president, he'd been so inspired by Jeff Canada and the Harlem Children's Zone, you probably mostly know who that is, that if he got to be president, he was going to do 20 Promised Neighborhoods inspired by Harlem Children's Zone. Jeff Canada's a great friend of mine. I was in the basement in Harlem working with him and residents in Harlem when they were planning the Harlem Children's Zone. He's on our board. And so he came to us and said, if this man gets elected president and he does this, we need to be ready. And so we began to really put together a plan for what Promised Neighborhoods would be. Promised Neighborhoods ended up getting moved into the transition team, then into the Department of Education. And a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 now, the Department of Education announced the first 21 planning grants. And Policy Link is running the Promised Neighborhoods Institute at Policy Link. And we brought all 21 of them together the past 2 days. Of the 21, they all brought teams, so we had over 100 people, and they came with community foundation leaders and school superintendents and community-based leaders and community-based organizations that had been working around early childhood and after-school programs. And hearing them talk about 3 things just so inspired me. 1, they were going to do this whether they had gotten this designation or not. That the funders had said the money would stay on the table, that the collaborations would stay together. The second thing that impressed me was that they all had a history of working together. As we went around and talked, they didn't just come together to do this application. They had been working together, and they understood that the education of children, helping them to reach their full potential, does not just happen in the classroom. It has to do with health and well-being and after school and supporting families. And the third thing that impressed me was their sense of how certain they were that this was something they could do. They could do it. They had a history of working together, and they were going to work on it with or without the designation. And we feel absolutely honored to be working with them. And they are from Los Angeles and Philadelphia and Detroit and Atlanta and actually Athens, Georgia. And they are also from rural areas and tribal areas. And to see that level of collaboration, I want to recommend it to you. Keep an eye on the Promised Neighborhoods. I think they're going to show us all something.
Other questions? Yes, way in the back there.
This is the last one. Someone down here told me that. That's not my decision.
Well, if I am the last one, thank you for taking a moment to hear my question. I come from a community in which diversity is not racial. It transcends racial boundaries. It transcends religious traditions. It transcends economic traditions, educational backgrounds, etc. I come from Milwaukee, and I represent, as Director of Philanthropy, that means head fundraiser, the Milwaukee Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Community Center. And I have a real concern with issues around our youth. I mean, our youth are looking at a situation in which we are teetering on the edge of whether we can serve in the military with dignity, where we can serve in the military with truthfulness, and we can serve in the military with honor. We're also looking at situations in which we question whether we can maintain any sort of civil rights. I know that in California we're the only minority in which civil rights have been reduced and taken away. I know of no other minority in which that has happened recently. And there has been a spate of suicides by LGBT youth in this country. And so I work with my youth in terms of the areas of the projects that we have and what they want to do with fundraising. But I think the real critical point with them is, what does it matter? If I work in a community, if I live in a nation that doesn't honor who I am for what I can contribute, what does it matter? So my question is, in that face of seemingly hopelessness at times, what do I tell them? How do I engage them? How do I move them into a place of civic engagement so that they see there is a future that is meaningful for them?
I'm glad you raised the question. I have been concerned, as everybody has, about the recent focus on the suicides and the bullying, and it is only a recent focus. It is not a recent phenomenon. And it's so interesting the way in this nation something gets in the news and we get concerned about it as if it's just now happening, and then when it's not in the news, we assume it's not happening anymore. I mean, are there no carjackings anymore? Did that just go away completely? And so I'm so happy you raised this issue, because when I do the conversation about equity and talking about everybody we have to be concerned about, it is in fact everybody. It is the lesbian and gay community. It is people with disabilities. It is everybody. And this notion of the Thanksgiving table, that's another place where the way that hope will come is when people just don't allow others to be able to say disparaging things. Just don't allow that to happen. And I will tell you, this is one where I've had to speak up many times in settings where I have not felt that my comment was welcome. But my commitment, and I wish it could be the commitment of everybody in this room and everybody you could influence, is that if we are in the room, everybody else's back is covered. I got your back. I got your back. And you don't have to worry. You don't have to worry that I'm going to allow this conversation to take place without correcting the misstatements, the wrong statements, the mean statements, and move people toward a place where we understand that everybody deserves our respect and our support to go forward. I think there is a lot of reason for hope. I can't tell you how many emails I have gotten over the course of the past 3 weeks talking about bullying, talking about the very issues that you've brought up, and they have come from quarters that I didn't necessarily expect that they would. So I think the hope is that at the moment people are looking inward and they are recognizing they haven't done enough, they haven't been inclusive enough, they haven't stood up enough, and again, California is going to get back right, as are lots of other places around the country. We are all in this together. We have to have everybody's back. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.